Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second of our quarterly genealogy workshops. I'm Heather Register Zabindin, the Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries and bookstore at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The Cowles Roberts Library Research Room is now open Tuesday through Friday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. for genealogical research, and you don't need an appointment anymore. You can also contact our genealogists at arcinfo@cowles.org, and I'll put that in the chat if you have questions or want to chat with them before your visit. We're also doing some regular bonus Saturdays from noon to, my teleprompter closed. It's never done that in 18 months. So it did it again. Okay, hang on just a second. I can say it by heart, but that would be rambling, and y'all do not want me rambling. Okay, we have regular bonus Saturdays from noon until 4, and the next one is actually going to be next Saturday, the 31st. So please come and hang out with us, and we can help you with your genealogy research. So in the past, the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies has hosted an all-day genealogy workshop in July. But due to COVID-19, the pandemic, we were forced to cancel last year's. And so we decided to do a series of quarterly genealogy workshops this year for 2021. Genealogy is something we pride ourselves on at the Central Arkansas Library System. In addition to the services at Roberts Library, we have tons and tons of books, y'all. If you've never been there, you need to come visit us. We offer a number of genealogical databases for both in-library and at-home use, like Ancestry and Heritage Quest, Fold 3, which is military records, newspapers.com and newspapersarchive.com. Also, my all-time favorite are fire insurance maps. And you can also join Rhonda Stewart and myself on the second Monday of each month at 3:30 for our Finding Family Facts genealogy workshop. So go to robertslibrary.org. Again, I'll put it in the chat for more information. Okay, so now for today's speaker. And if you have any questions for today's speaker, please put them in the chat and we will take questions at kind of the end of each session. These will not be live on camera. They will be, I'll be reading them to Mr. Christmas and he'll be able to answer them. He will answer them live on camera. Okay, now for today's program. Thank you for taking a break from your summer activities and joining us for this workshop. Some of you may have been watching the Olympics this morning. Did you know the Olympics are on? I've learned that genealogists are always curious about my last name. So Zabindin is Swiss German. I always like to say it's Swiss German by way of East Tennessee because my husband's from Chattanooga. But in Switzerland, Zabindin is a common name, and there was part of the distant past family that owned a chain of department stores. So it was a name that folks in Switzerland were really familiar with. And the Z and the B sitting together without a vowel in between always makes people think it's Czech, but it's Swiss German. So like many of you, I'm curious about our speaker's last name, and hopefully he'll tell us the origin of his last name, Christmas. So today we have 2 sessions on slightly different areas of genetic genealogy. So this session this morning is beginner genetic genealogy, and the second session is applying genetic genealogy techniques, and that will start at 12:30. So we'll take a break between these 2 sessions for about an hour so you can get a bite to eat. But the Zoom link will be the same for both, and I'll actually leave the webinar open during the lunch break so that it's not complicated to come back in. Okay, Now, that's all the housekeeping business. So let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Shannon Christmas is an experienced genealogist specializing in genetic, colonial America, and African American genealogy in Virginia and the Carolinas. He serves as a 23andMe Ancestry Ambassador and an Ancestry.com ace. Christmas has a special interest in using DNA to verify and extend pedigrees, to assess the veracity of oral history, and reconstruct ancestral genomes. So everybody give a warm virtual welcome to Mr. Shannon Christmas.
Thank you ever so much for having me. I am quite elated to be here, and hopefully everyone will learn a few things. So the beginner's genetic genealogy largely covers the basics of DNA testing and how to use it in the most basic sense. Where to test, how to test, and how many to test. Okay. So genealogy often becomes a pastime because individuals are attempting to answer some challenging questions about their own family history. Specifically, where did my ancestors come from before arriving in what we now call the United States of America? There might be questions involving paternity of certain ancestors. And there might just be what we all have, those brick walls that are always so vexing. Generally, when we want to answer these questions, we go to paper records, but that may not be enough. You may find that birth records prior to the 19th century are not well preserved if they were even generated in the first place, depending on the context. You may find that the US Census, the workhorse of American genealogy, has many errors and omissions that make it less accurate and certainly less conclusive. You may also find that some of the state and local records that could help you answer those questions that you've wanted the answers to for ever so long have been destroyed, either by natural forces or man-made forces. So then we rely on oral history, which has its own set of issues. You may find that oral history is like playing a game of intergenerational telephone, where facts are passed down from generation to generation, but over time, those facts mutate because they are miscommunicated from one generation to the next. Or in other cases, you find that oral history is just gone because the ancestor or the relative who knew everything has passed away before communicating any of that history to anyone else. So then we turn to DNA testing to hopefully bridge the gaps left in both the documentary records and the oral history. Specifically, we turn to 4 different types of DNA. The first of which, Y chromosome DNA, is passed down from father to son each generation on the Y chromosome, allowing one to use this type of DNA to trace one's father's line, or what we call direct paternal lines. Mitochondrial DNA, on the other hand, is passed down from mother to child each generation, which allows you to trace one's mother's line, or what we call direct maternal lines. To be very precise, mitochondrial DNA is something that every human has. It is the type of DNA that is within what we call the mitochondria of a cell. Mitochondria are responsible for the molecular respiration, if you will, of the cell. And so what happens is that while women and men have mitochondrial DNA, only women pass down mitochondrial DNA to their children. Men cannot do that. So that is why it is so great for tracing one's mother's line. Now, autosomal DNA and X chromosome DNA are quite different. Everyone has autosomal DNA, and everyone can pass down autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA refers to DNA that is found on chromosomes 1 through 22. Each human that exists has 23 pairs of chromosomes, and the first 22 pairs are called autosomes, chromosomes 1 through 22. You get one set of autosomes from your father. 50% of your autosomal DNA comes from your father. You get another set of autosomes from your mother. You get 50% of your autosomal DNA from your mother. And so that means that you get half from your father and half from your mother. There is no situation where someone is brought into the world with autosomal DNA from only one parent. So this reflects all of your parentage, but even more importantly, that DNA that's being passed down from your parents on the autosomes is inherited from all of your ancestors within at least the last 5 generations. Now that 23rd pair of chromosomes are called sex chromosomes. One of those sex chromosomes I've already mentioned, the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is something that determines whether someone is going to be male, meaning that you have to be a man to get a Y chromosome. Now, the X chromosome is also a sex chromosome, and everyone gets an X chromosome. We just don't get the same quantity of X chromosomes. So, for a man, he will inherit one X chromosome, and that X chromosome is always going to come from his mother, and it's going to reflect her ancestors. Women, on the other hand, inherit 2 X chromosomes, one from the father, and that X chromosome reflects all of his maternal ancestry. And then there's an X chromosome that a woman will inherit from her mother. The X chromosome has a very unique inheritance pattern. And so there's actually a process of charting out your ancestors who passed down or could have passed down X chromosome DNA. In other words, there's no situation involving X chromosome DNA where it is directly inherited from one man by another man. And there's an entire course that you can take on X chromosome DNA. But this is not that course, so I'm going to move right along. Now, for a long time, DNA test companies only tested Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. And as you can see from this image in this slide, that type of testing only allows you to look at two lines in your entire family, leaving out all of these other ancestral lines from any type of genetic research. So that is something that you need to keep in mind as you think about which DNA test to take and how to apply them to your own specific genealogical questions. Now, Y-DNA testing, Y-DNA marker mutation analysis, as it is called, has long been the workhorse of genetic genealogy. And I say that because it's done a number of things. It allows you to look at deep ancestral origins. In other words, where one's father's line came from prior to arriving in what we now call the United States of America. We have this thing called haplogroups. Haplogroups refer to essentially populations that are associated with a specific Y-DNA signature that has come from a specific part of the world. So Y-DNA is very powerful for looking at the origin, the biogeographical origin of one's father's line. Y-DNA is also helpful for building and testing paternity hypotheses. Why is that? Because Y-DNA follows the same pattern of inheritance as surnames. So men inherit their father's surname and they inherit their father's Y-DNA. And going along this route for generations allows you to assume that if you are looking for your biological father, then he has that same surname that's associated with that Y-DNA that you've inherited from him. So this allows you to find, in the case of male adoptees and the children of unknown fathers, the likely surname of the biological father. In this image on the right, you are looking at a photograph of Mr. John Weeks Jefferson. Mr. John Weeks Jefferson is a direct descendant of Eston Hemings, who, in case you don't already know, was the son of an enslaved woman named Sally Hemings, who was long rumored to have been the mother of several children of Thomas Jefferson's, President Thomas Jefferson's. Mr. John Weeks Jefferson tested his Y-DNA and discovered that his Y-DNA signature was an exact match to that of descendants of President Thomas Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson, indicating that there was at least some genetic evidence to substantiate the rumors that had been passed down for centuries. If you are interested in doing this type of DNA testing, then you need to test at Family Tree DNA. They provide the best option for doing Y-DNA testing. In fact, they provide the only option for doing this type of Y-DNA testing. You want to start with purchasing a Y-DNA 37, 67, or perhaps a Y-DNA 111 test. Remember that since only men inherit Y-DNA, only men can take a Y-DNA test. The more markers you test, the better, the higher the resolution of the results. So 37 refers to 37 markers. Y-DNA 67 refers to 67 markers, and so on. And once again, you want to do this at family tree DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA follows a very similar inheritance pattern. However, mitochondrial DNA tends to be less genealogically informative. Mitochondrial DNA only allows you to trace a single direct female line, one's mother's 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 line. And as we know, women change surnames every generation. So that makes it, in many cases, a little bit challenging to work with mitochondrial DNA, just on that alone. However, mitochondrial DNA also mutates very slowly, meaning that you and another individual could have the exact same mitochondrial DNA and discover that you cannot identify a recent ancestor. And that is because the recent ancestor, or I should say, the most recent common ancestor, might be as far back as over 1,000 years ago. And I know that some people say that they have a family tree going back to Adam and Eve, but I am sorry, I have my doubts. So you are very unlikely to be able to make use of mitochondrial DNA for a genealogical question that goes back that far. However, this image that you see in the slide on the right refers to a success story. The living person that you see, the gentleman with the glasses, is a Mr. Ibsen who had his mitochondrial DNA tested, and his DNA was specifically tested because there was a sneaking suspicion that his mitochondrial DNA might be beneficial in determining the identity of a set of bones, a skeleton, remains found in a car park in England. Specifically, the remains were suspected to be those of King Richard III. Now, King Richard III's remains had DNA, and specifically mitochondrial DNA, that could be tested if they could find living descendants of one of King Richard III's sisters, direct female line descendants. So they traced her descendancy into the present day, and they found Mr. Ibsen to be one of those direct female line descendants. Tested his mitochondrial DNA, and it was an exact match to the mitochondrial DNA found in the car park in England, helping to identify the remains as those of King Richard III. So you can use mitochondrial DNA for certain genealogical research questions, but they do have to be well defined and well thought out. So keep that in mind. And once again, mitochondrial DNA is very helpful for looking at deep maternal ancestry, looking at, once again, haplogroups, a specific population in a specific part of the world associated with a specific mitochondrial DNA signature. To get this type of analysis, you need to go straight to Family Tree DNA, once again, because they are the only company providing this type of analysis. And you want to go straight for the full mitochondrial sequence, meaning that you are having your entire mitochondria sequenced for that particular type of test. This will give you a very high resolution result. And again, you want to test with Family Tree DNA. Now, autosomal DNA testing provides you with many more opportunities to learn more about your ancestors, because as you can see in this diagram, autosomal DNA is reflecting a genetic inheritance from all of one's family lines within the last 5 generations, at least. To do this type of testing, you want to go to 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, Family Finder at Family Tree DNA, MyHeritage DNA, and Living DNA. Your results will consist of what we call biogeographical analysis, also known as admixture results, where your DNA is compared to reference samples from populations all over the world and broken down into percentages showing how you match those reference samples. You will also get a list of DNA matches, your genetic relatives, meaning that you share a common ancestor within a genealogical time frame. Your results should cover about 400 to 500 years of ancestry. And generally, the test kits cost about $99. But in the case of 23andMe's Health Plus Ancestry product, you should expect to pay $199 per kit. Now, I know that there is a lot of focus on this type of result, the admixture results, the biogeographical ancestry results that some people use to determine whether they should wear lederhosen or kilts. But this is a very broad overview of your ancestry. This is not typically going to provide you with names and dates and stories about who your ancestors were, what they did, where they lived, and the other descendants that they have. A great number of people are attracted to this part of the test because they come from what I call the LOL, OMG, everybody look at me brigade. These are social media mavens looking for whatever they can find to perhaps persuade people that they are far more interesting than they actually are. And they post their results to social media out of desperation for attention. The real power in autosomal DNA testing is in what we call identity by descent detection. Identity by descent refers to stretches of shared DNA on chromosomes 1 through 22 and the X chromosome. These chromosomes, these packages for your DNA, are simply passing down, or I should say packaging, genetic information passed down by your ancestors. So that shared DNA on chromosomes 1 through 22 and the X chromosome is just genetic inheritance from a common ancestor. You share DNA with these individuals, because you are related to them. The question is, who is the common ancestor? And you get list of relatives based on this information at 23andMe, Family Finder, Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage DNA, and now Living DNA. This type of information can make it much easier to answer some of those challenging questions that have driven people to pursue genealogy in the first place. One of the ways that we do that is through a process called clustering, also known as genetic networking. This involves identifying groups of DNA matches who all match you and all match each other. And then understanding that that group of people, that group of DNA matches, all must share a common ancestor. The question is, who is the common ancestor? Answering the question involves collecting and comparing family trees in a process known as Pedigree Comparison. The ancestor that you find in all of those trees, the ancestor that you see connecting all of these individuals, is the ancestor from whom you all descend. This explains why you form a cluster or a genetic network, because you are all descendants of this ancestor or ancestral couple. Now, the various testing sites have on-site tools that you can use to begin clustering and genetic networking. Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage DNA call such a tool shared matches. Family Tree DNA's Family Finder has a tool called In Common With. At 23andMe, the tool is called Relatives in Common. You want to pay attention to these tools. They are not simply there for decoration. They are, in fact, among the most powerful tools on the site. Another methodology that we use is called chromosome mapping, a two-step process of tagging specific DNA segments to specific ancestors. Today, this is considered to be an advanced topic. But when I first got into genetic genealogy over 12 years ago, this was considered the only methodology. So I suspect that we have, on some level, advanced in developing new methods, easier methods, if you will, because of the growth of the DNA databases. There are so many people now that a network effect has been generated, and you don't always need to do chromosome mapping. But I still find it to be a fantastic way to go. At any rate, chromosome mapping involves two steps. The first step is called segment triangulation. The second step is called pedigree comparison. Segment triangulation involves identifying a group of individuals, a group of DNA matches who all match you and all match each other, all on the same DNA segment. That indicates that each of you inherited that same DNA segment from the same common ancestor or common ancestral couple. The question is, who is the common ancestor? Answering that question involves the next step, pedigree comparison. Once again, you collect and compare the family trees of everyone within that group of matches, which we call a triangulated group, and you just compare the family trees. The ancestor that appears in all of those trees is the ancestor from whom each of you inherited that shared DNA segment. To get the most out of this type of testing, you need to test everyone, everywhere. Start at Ancestry Dna and 23andMe's Ancestry-only edition. This will cost you generally about $99 each. And you do need to test with both of these companies directly. They do not permit transfers. You have to provide a sample. That sample has to be analyzed. That is the only way to get results from Ancestry Dna and 23andMe. Once you receive your results from Ancestry Dna, you need to download the raw DNA data and transfer it to Family Tree's Family Finder. That's Family Tree DNA's Family Finder for free. To get access to the advanced tools at Family Finder, you generally have to pay $19. That's a one-time fee of $19. You also will want to transfer your raw DNA data file to a third-party site called gedmatch.com. It is a free site, but donations are recommended and well rewarded. If you pay $10 per month, you will receive access to advanced DNA tools as GEDmatch. You also want to transfer your DNA data to MyHeritage DNA and also to Living DNA. You also want to repeat these steps for family members who you need to have tested. If you can afford the resources involved with testing directly with each of the venues, then I recommend you do that instead. And I say do that because some of the websites are experiencing some challenges with attempting to match people who have tested with different sites. So it might be in your best interest, if you can so afford, to go ahead and test with each of these directly, except for GEDmatch, because they do not do testing. They only do transfers. And once again, you need to repeat these steps for family members. Now, when we discuss family members to test, who to test, the best people to test are your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, and if you still have them available, your 2 times great-grandparents. The next best sources of DNA include your aunts and uncles, your granduncles and grandaunts, your first cousins and second cousins and third cousins. These are people that you want to test, most especially because they will allow you, since you already know who they are and how they are related to you, to look at what we talked about earlier, the shared matches, and begin to hypothesize about how the unknown matches that appear as shared matches are related to you. For instance, the matches that are matching you and your biological mother are likely to be maternal relatives. If you see that your paternal grandparents, or in particular, your paternal grandfather, for instance, is showing a list of shared matches, then you can hypothesize that those shared matches, those matches you share with your paternal grandfather, must share an ancestor on that line of your family. So this will help you to organize your matches when you test these specific members of your family. You also have to understand the pros and cons of each of these tests. Ancestry Dna has the largest DNA database by far. It also has one of the best tree interfaces, but it also lacks analytic tools that you might find useful and that you might find elsewhere. It also has a messaging system that at best is hit or miss, and there's also an issue of what we call false negative matching. In other words, you have actual DNA relatives in Ancestry's DNA database that do not show up as Ancestry DNA relatives. And that is because they have an algorithm that, as they put it, downweights pieces of DNA that Ancestry DNA's algorithm determines to be less indicative of a recent common ancestor. But from the observation of various genetic genealogists, including myself, this particular algorithm tends to go a bit overboard in that process and will actually eliminate matches that should appear on your match list or otherwise would appear on your match list if you and this person were in a different database. 23andMe has the second largest DNA database, and it is also known for being very diverse because of the various projects that 23andMe has had over the years for Irish research or African research, etc. 23andMe also has the best chromosome browser, which allows you to compare your matches to you and also compare your matches, well, to your matches and see the pieces of DNA that you share illustrated on the chromosomes. But it also has a challenging messaging system. And 23andMe actually caps your matches at 1,500. And if you want more matches, if you want 5,000 matches, you have to pay a subscription fee to get to see them at 23andMe. 23andMe also tends to have the highest price if you are going for the health plus ancestry product that 23andMe offers. Now, MyHeritage DNA has a large and growing database, also has a very nice tree interface and a growing list of tools, but some find that the tools still require some additional refinement. Family Tree DNA's Family Finder offers the most transparent communication. They do not have a messaging system. They simply provide you with your match's email addresses and you contact them directly. They also have some very easy to use tools, but they also have the smallest DNA database, despite having been around longer than Ancestry and MyHeritage DNA. They have the smallest DNA database, and they too have some false negative matching problems, but we are looking to see whether those problems have been cleared up by a recent update that Family Tree DNA has completed this month. So when you undertake all of this, you need to understand a few things. Number one, this is a project that requires a lot of patience and a thirst for knowledge. Some of your matches will take a very long time to reply. If they ever do, an increasing number of matches do not have trees, and they will require your assistance in building them. As I often say, some matches will not speak to you until after you have found the common ancestor. And some matches will discontinue communicating with you once you have found the common ancestor. I often say that connecting with matches requires a degree in dentistry because you often feel as if you are extracting teeth from someone else's mouth. Understand that the technology is very dynamic and changes frequently, requiring you to constantly re-educate yourself. Despite all of that, persist until you prevail. You can do it if you try. Thank you ever so much. I stand ready to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Shannon. That was fascinating. If anybody has questions, put them in the chat. Oh, wait, we do have one in the Q&A. Okay, let me. Oh, she says, Stella says, great information. Thank you. If you'll put your questions in the chat, I will read them out. But I always like to, and if anybody's been to our Finding Family Facts, they've heard me say this. I am adopted, and I will tell you, I have no desire to do a DNA test because I don't want to find the family that raised me. My adoptive family is my family, and I have no. So, can you talk a little bit about, how adoptive folks have used DNA, pros and cons? I mean, I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this before. So I apologize if I'm springing this on you, but I know that there have been good stories. I know that there have been horrible stories. So,
Well, that is a fair question. So yes, many adoptees have utilized genetic testing services to identify biological parents. And the process generally has involved doing an autosomal DNA test, and in the case of some men, also doing a Y-DNA test, and starting with the closest matches, doing much of what I mentioned earlier with the clustering and genetic networking, seeing who matches whom, and comparing the trees amongst the various groups that you would find, clusters, if you will, or genetic networks, and beginning to see how these people relate to each other, and building out trees that show the various descendant lines of the common ancestors found through the process, and then determining which branch you share the most DNA with, and then looking at that branch very carefully to find one's grandparents, and then determining which of the children of those grandparents is your mother or father. The outcomes in terms of the quality of the reunion, if there is a reunion, it varies. I think that in my observation over the years, there are many individuals who are both adopted and very realistic about what they may discover. And then there is another subset of adoptees who believe that finding their biological family will essentially alleviate all ills for them, and that there will be the type of reunion that everyone would want to have.
yeah.
And one has to be, to use the term I've already used, realistic. Humans are humans. We may not know the details of how we were conceived, and those details may play a part in how one is received by the biological family.
Yep.
And in some cases, the biological family does not wish to be in contact. And you have to be ready to process what it is like to look for someone who is not looking for you.
Yes. Yes. And I think, I think a lot of people, because of the commercials and because of the great marketing that the different companies have done, people haven't thought about it. And then, you've got folks who didn't know they were adopted, and they go and they take a DNA test and they find out. I can't imagine, I can't imagine. I've known my entire life that I was adopted. So thank you. So we have lots of questions and comments in the chat now. I do have to point out, when you made the lederhosen versus kilt comment, Kim Little up in Conway, who I know, laughed, and I was laughing. Kim, I was laughing at the same time too, because I immediately knew exactly which commercial you were talking about. So I love that reference. You're getting lots of comments about how informative it was. Let's see, Pam says, very clearly explained. For the first time, I finally have a clear picture of the differences in what DNA can do. Thank you so much. Becky Berry asks, where do you start on maternal side when you know nothing more than mother, grandmother, and adoptive grandfather's names? And then her second question is, what if there is some question on the paternal side that my father may have had a different father than his siblings?
Okay, excellent question. To start with, it sounds as if the grandmother in the first question was adopted. And so if that is what you meant to describe, then that means that, number one, you want to have the grandmother tested. If not, if you cannot have the grandmother tested, then you want to have her children tested, her biological children, and also have the grandfather test. And I say do that if the grandmother is not available, because then it makes it much easier to identify which matches are on the grandmother's side. And you go through a process of, once again, looking at groups of matches on the grandmother's side who all match each other and comparing their family trees to essentially reconstruct the family tree of the adoptive grandmother. The second question seemed to revolve around, if I understood correctly, someone having a different biological father. Then you want to have that person, if possible, take an autosomal DNA test along with that person's siblings and see whether they show up as full siblings or half siblings. And that will give you your answer. If they do happen to be half siblings, then the parent who is just one sibling's parent and not the parent of all the rest, the father, the biological father of the person who is a half sibling to everyone else, those will jump out at you. And so once again, you go through the same process of looking at the closest unknown matches on that particular side and comparing the trees to see how they all intersect, and then build into the present day and look at who could potentially be the biological father using a process of logic to deduce the identity, looking at ages and locations.
Great, thank you. I think that answered it. So Kim Little says, I'm trying to connect my fourth great grandmother with her sister. My line to her is through mother, grandmother, great grandfather, great great grandfather, and great 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 grandfather. The suspected cousins I know about are father daughter in her early 20s. The daughter has done a DNA test. Is it possible we can make this connection?
It is indeed
Did you
possible.
get all those grades?
Yes, I
Okay.
most certainly did. And you can certainly make those types of discoveries. For my own family, I've been able to demolish brick walls using DNA and identify great, 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 great grandparents and beyond. So, yes, it certainly is possible.
Great. Randy Simon Saray, I hope I pronounced that right. She says, I'm part Jewish with descent from a known population who practiced endomology. Sorry.
Endogamy.
I understand that many thank you. Thank you so much. I understand that many slave populations did this as well, since their choice of partners was likewise limited. Can you explain endomology for dummies, how it affects DNA results?
Great question. So endogamy refers to populations where everyone is related to each other in many different ways. In other words, someone who comes from the Ashkenazi Jewish population and another person from an Ashkenazi Jewish population are very likely to share DNA, even if the most recent common ancestor is well beyond the scope of recent genealogical records within the last 5 generations. And that is because that population is one in which any pair of individuals shares multiple family lines going back many generations. And so what happens with this in terms of DNA test results is that, number one, to continue with the Ashkenazi Jewish example, all of the Ashkenazi Jewish matches sort of take over one's DNA match list. There's many more of them than, say, your other side of your family that is not Ashkenazi Jewish. And so you might get into a situation where you cannot even see your non-Ashkenazi Jewish DNA matches. The other part of this is understanding at a very advanced level, if you will, that what will happen is that you will share a lot of DNA with these matches, and much of that DNA comes through in terms of small segments. In other words, longer DNA segments tend to be indicative of a more recent common ancestor, and shorter segments are typically indicative of a more distant relationship. And so your Ashkenazi Jewish matches, in many cases, share a lot of little small segments, meaning that they look more closely related than they actually are, because you share all of these different little segments that come from all of these distant relatives or distant ancestors, as opposed to getting a lot of DNA from one recent common ancestor. So they're more distantly related and they take over your match list. And the best thing that you can do, if you can do this, is sort your DNA match list by what we call the length of the longest DNA segment. With those who share the longest DNA segments going to the top of your match list, and those who share the smallest segments going towards the bottom of the list. That way, the truly closest DNA matches will rise to the top, and the more distant matches will go to the bottom.
Robert Lindley, who's our friend who comes to a lot of our programs, says that he's helping his wife find her biological parents using DNA to help her solve some medical concerns. And I know that that is a very common, thing that people do, adoptees do to find those medical concerns. So yeah, that is one of the important parts of all of this DNA. Stella Cameron says, my brother is working diligently to trace our family tree. He gets discouraged when he sends in questions and no one ever answers him. I was glad to hear you say to not get discouraged, because that's one of his biggest complaints. Do you have any tips for him?
That is a great question. I do, and some of this is covered in the second presentation of the day. But I will simply say that it is crucial to ensure that your messaging to your DNA matches is crystal clear and written at a third grade level. And ensure that what you write is not too technical or overwhelming, because many of the testers have tested for reasons other than genealogy. As I mentioned before, many have tested just wanting to get an admixture result and say, oh, look at me. I'm XYZ percentage Irish or African or Native American. And they were not looking to find family. They were not looking for cousins. They were looking for countries. And I have some concerns about those types of motivations. That said, there are ways to get around that, because some of these matches actually read the messages and refuse to reply. So I always tell individuals it is important when doing this to be a triple threat, to learn not only the genealogy, but also how to utilize the testing itself, and then also how to be a cyber stalker. Many of your matches will not have family trees. So you have to learn how to use the internet to essentially scrape the web for the information you need to build family trees for them. And so that is my best answer at this time. There will be some more detailed answers to those types of questions in the second presentation today.
Great. So Becky Berry says, what if our family has handed down a story of strong Cherokee Indian heritage? Both 23andMe and Ancestry.com say we have no Indian blood.
Yes, I get
Cherokee
this question a lot.
Yeah.
So yes, I would say that one has to consider the context of Native American ancestry and also the context of DNA testing. So one thing to keep in mind is that Native American ancestry has historically been utilized as cultural camouflage for those individuals who were a mixture of European ancestry and African ancestry. These individuals had to essentially say that they were Native American in terms of ancestry to explain away physical features that reflected the mixture of African and European ancestry in a world that was racially stratified. So that is one reason why you might come across this type of a situation. It may also arise when a family story is created that explains a connection to a people, but that connection is not necessarily biological. You know, tribal membership in a Native American group, if not and was not always a biological construct. In other words, you did not necessarily need to descend from an indigenous person to be identified as a member of a Native American tribe. On the other hand, there are cases where someone in the family, an ancestor, was in fact a Native American, was in fact descended from an indigenous population, and that ancestor was just so far back that living descendants did not inherit the pieces of DNA from the indigenous ancestors. So that is another reason. And lastly, it could just be that the story was just a lie that someone created to fascinate generations.
Rhonda always says, because we get this question a lot in our second Monday programs, and she always says that, you have to take what you find in the record and compare it with the stories. And it's okay if it's different than the stories. And, you take the good, bad, and the ugly and you embrace it because, you find out not just about, lack of Indian heritage, but divorces and other things, when you're looking at the records. So Bernadette Cahill says, I'm trying to find the father of my grandfather on my mother's side and who exactly we are related to. This is all Irish and Scots-Irish background in Scotland. From what you say, it seems I need DNA and probably something else. How do I get DNA from people who are long dead? She says, I'm still overwhelmed. And Bernadette wrote a blog post for us about some of this for the July 4th weekend. So thank you, Bernadette, for doing that. But yeah, I thought about that earlier, when you have dead relatives and you need to get their DNA, how do you do that?
That is an interesting question as well. There is a company which has dabbled with DNA from postage stamps and envelopes that your ancestor may have licked. The name of the company is To the Letter DNA, and that's TO the letter DNA.com. And that is one route to go, but there are no guarantees, and it can get, rather expensive for those who are not inclined to expend too much on the research. But other than that, you don't get DNA from the corpses of your ancestors. You just work with what you have. Say, for instance, you don't have a grandparent that you want to test around any longer. Then you go to your first cousin who also got DNA from that same grandparent. Same with a great grandparent. You go to someone who would be uh, a great grandchild of that great grandparent, a second cousin, and you have them test. You use them as what some call proxies uh, for the deceased, if that makes any sense. Uh, Also, if you have a parent that you would have tested, but they're not around, then you test all of that parents' living siblings, your aunts and uncles.
Well, and I think, you use the example of Richard III. I think one of the more recent ones is of course, the Romanov family, the last Tsar and his family, and using, I think, Prince Michael, Duke of Kent, to, I may be getting my princes mixed up, but using, or maybe even the Duke of Edinburgh's DNA to make sure that everybody, in that grave was who they were. And that, that ended one of a centuries long mystery of whether, some of these imposters were really imposters. So it's fascinating.
Yes, the Anastasia episode was
Yes.
quite entertaining for several centuries, but yes, DNA puts that to rest. Well, I guess it wasn't several centuries, but long enough.
Long enough, yes. Let's see. So Carolyn Penn, who's one of our regulars in our Monday class, says, I had my Ancestry DNA tested a while back. What will I discover from doing 23andMe as well?
So with each database, you are looking at a different data set. In other words, you are getting a slightly different group of people. And so you may find a match there that is perhaps more useful for explaining a specific family line at 23andMe than what you found elsewhere. So that is why it is so important to test with each of the databases, or to transfer into those databases that you can transfer to, because there are matches there that might be just what you need to answer that question. Not everyone tests with all of the databases. Not everyone tests with 23andMe. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I'm also a research manager at Ancestry. I used to be an Ancestry Ambassador at 23andMe. I am a project administrator for a number of projects at Family Tree DNA. I'm an influencer for MyHeritage DNA and also for Living DNA. And I work with all of the companies. And I can safely say that working with each of them has greatly enriched my research in ways that just working with one could never have done.
I had muted myself because my child was getting ice out of the ice maker. So sorry about that. I think you also answered Matthew Bloom's question. He says he participated in the Genographic Society, the Geno 2.0 DNA testing project in 2014. And he asked, is it worthwhile to participate in others? Yes, do them all if you're going to do them, I guess, is the quick and easy answer, right?
Well, yes, you want to do all of the genealogical DNA tests that are out there, but also be clear on what genealogical DNA test means. That means a test that actually matches you with relatives. There are a lot of other types of DNA test out there that I do not recommend, that will simply provide you with something that is not of any use when it comes to genealogy. And so I know that at Ancestry Genealogist, where I am a research manager, we work with all sorts of DNA tests for clients, but it's just the genealogical ones: Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and 23andMe. Uh, and we work with the matches in order to answer genealogical questions. The other types of tests that are out there, they don't do that.
So Alfreda Brown has a great question. This is one I'm really interested in. She says, my family recently discovered the will of the slave owner who divided his slaves among his children upon his death. All the slaves carry this man's name. We are assuming that the slaves who went to one of his daughters are our relatives. Is this a false assumption?
I would say that is an hypothesis that needs to be tested.
Mhm.
You have to go find those descendants and get them DNA tested and see if there is a connection. And I've worked with situations like those many times, and they're always fascinating. Uh, but you simply don't know until you have the evidence in hand.
And I think for years, there was a slight misnomer that slaves automatically took their master's last name. And I think we're finding more and more that just wasn't true. I mean, there are some that did take that name, but not necessarily. So yeah, dig
Yes,
deeper. It's a
absolutely.
marathon, not a sprint.
I absolutely agree. Uh, there were many free people after the Civil War who, upon achieving, or I should say, getting their freedom, uh, decided to take a surname that had nothing to do with either their last enslaver or any of the previous enslavers, if they had more than one. There are many African Americans today who have the surnames Washington and Jefferson, but their ancestors were never enslaved by a Washington or a Jefferson. They just saw those names as the names of presidents, as names of people that were respected in America and sought that same respect.
So Anne Buchanan says, can you talk about DNA segments? That may be more in your second, and that may be a whole nother program.
Well, this will be reviewed in the second presentation, but to answer simply, DNA segments are just pieces of DNA. When we inherit DNA, uh, we get it in segments. Uh, the DNA that you inherit from your biological parents are, are simply an assembly of segments that they inherited from their parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents. And each time a child is conceived, this process happens where segments from various ancestors are cut up and reassembled and passed down to the next generation.
So Randy Simon Saray, again, Randy, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, wants to know, how do people born with other XY combinations, the XXY, the XXYY, etc., interpret their results?
That is an excellent question. Uh, Generally, from what I have heard, from those companies that actually test and present results based on the X and the Y. In some cases, one of the X's is ignored. And in some cases, one of the Y chromosomes is ignored. That is my best answer.
Let's see. Becky Berry says, I'm 65 and my parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles have all passed. I have 5 siblings, 3 living children, and 6 grandchildren. I do have some contact with 2 cousins on Facebook. Can enough information be obtained from the living to trace ancestry? And can DNA be found in ashes?
So, yes, I would start with working with the living. I do think that depending on your research question and the type of DNA that you test, you can certainly begin the process of researching through DNA your ancestors. In terms of trying to get DNA from ashes, I think that is too tall of an order to even consider. I say just work with what you have in terms of the living and hope for the best.
Someone asked if I'm going to put all of this information in the chat. No, but this is being recorded, and so you'll be able to view it again if you missed something. I'm trying to put as much in the chat as I can, but yeah, we should be. Cindy, tell me exactly, specifically, if there's something you want me to put in the chat, and I'll try to do it. He's giving so much information, and I would definitely spell things wrong. Because that's just me. Let's see. Alfreda Brown asks, are you available for private consultation to trace family lines?
Yes, I am. And if anyone is interested, feel free to visit throughtheTreesblog.tumblr.com and you can email me there. My email address is there for consultations. And all of my consultations at this time will have to go through Ancestry Genealogist, the research arm of Ancestry.com. And just specifically email me about your request and we will see what we can do.
Great. So I'm going to end the questions for this session with Carla Coleman, one of my favorite people. And I saw that Tamala Tenpenny said hi, so she wanted to tell you hello, Mr. Christmas. But
hello.
Carla asks, what if DNA links match on the same chromosome? Is that a lead? What if your DNA links match on the same chromosome? Is that a lead? I think I read it wrong.
All right. So the same chromosome is not the same thing as the same segment. In other words, if you are matching up on the same DNA segment on the same chromosome, you match 2 people and those 2 people match each other all on the same segment, and that's you on the same segment on the same chromosome. That is what we call a triangulated group, and that is indicative of having each of the 3 people inherit that segment of DNA from the same common ancestor. Just saying on the same chromosome, on the other hand, is not necessarily indicative of anything at all.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This first session has been so interesting, and I am excited to hear what you have to say on the second session, which is about applying some of these techniques. So I'm going to leave this open, guys. And so you can stay here. You can also, if you need to leave the webinar for whatever reason, just simply use the link that you had before to come back in. It's the same link. And we'll be back about 12:30 for our second program. And Shannon, if you want to just leave that slide up right there. Oops. Okay. I'll put something else up so that there's something that people, oh, thanks. Yeah. If you just want to leave that up, unless you need to do some work on your computer, that would be great for me.
All right.
So we will be, yeah. So we'll be.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Rhonda. You can turn your video on.
Oh, I can?
You should be
Oh,
able
you
to.
did.
Let me, hang on. Maybe I have to.
Yeah, you have to.
I think I have to. Okay. So now in the lower left-hand corner, you should have a camera that you can click.
Okay.
There you
Hi.
go. We've got a few more minutes. So we'll get started right at 12:30. Yes, I'm sorry if Randy, you're listening. Yes, I'm sorry. We're in Central Time. So Randy, my husband, I think I mentioned earlier, Randy says, she doesn't know what time she's on sometimes. My husband is from Chattanooga, and Chattanooga is right on like 10 minutes outside of Chattanooga is Central Time. They're in Eastern Time. People live in Central Time and work in Eastern Time and vice versa. And I just think, how do you wrap your brain around that? And someone told me once that they pick one and they stay on it the whole time. So if they work in Eastern Time, they make themselves live. That would hurt my head.
Well, I know what
That's
you
crazy
mean.
and cruel. Yes.
Yes, I work in Mountain Time, and I live
Oh my God.
in Eastern Time.
So you have to jump 2 hours. Wow.
Yes.
Yes. Time zones. And then they go and they make us fall back and spring forward. And there are places that don't do what? Indiana and Arizona don't recognize the time change. So that's why I live in the middle of Arkansas.
Well, I think that's
Okay.
more people will get
Sorry.
used to it.
Okay, Rhonda. So Rhonda has
Yeah.
joined me on screen, and it's 12:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. Take it away.
All right. Thank you all for showing up for today's presentation. Thank you, Mr. Christmas. I appreciate you doing this for us. I am Rhonda Stewart. I am the Genealogy and Local History Specialist for the Central Arkansas Library System's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies in the Bobby L. Roberts Library building. And it's a long name because we are a big business. If you have not used your public library system, please try ours because we're good. And we don't mind sharing that. But seriously, the library is there for you, and do take advantage of what we do offer. I also wanted to acknowledge some of the sister organizations we have in the city that do genealogy. If you have not joined an organization specializing in genealogy research, you should. Simply, my attitude is different interpretations of facts presented will either strengthen, confirm, or blow up your whole theory about who you are. So having that organization that you can bounce facts off with or have different interpretations of facts is important. So if you've not enlisted or involved yourself with one of the genealogical societies locally or where you live, please do. Here in Little Rock, there's the African American Historical Genealogical Society. There's the Heritage Seekers Genealogical Society. There's the Arkansas Genealogical Society, who have been consistently involved with our genealogy program at the Central Arkansas Library System since my inception at the library 16 and a half years ago, but even longer than since I've been there. And if you're not good at working with groups, which I'm not, those of you that have known me for a couple of decades know I won't necessarily join a group, but I will be associated with a group because I have adult attention deficit disorder and I'm easily distracted, which is why I usually don't work from home. So, but being a part of an organization actually strengthens your knowledge and what you know. I learned just like you all learn. And while some people consider me an expert in this, I am not in my mind because I'm consistently learning. And sometimes what you teach me is something I hadn't looked at from an angle that I hadn't looked at. So thank you all for teaching me also. So it's a give and take situation with genealogy, and it's vital. It's important. There's no history without genealogy. So do the genealogical part also. And to Mr. Christmas, I appreciate you doing this program for us. I do know that you have strengthened my theory that Arkansas runs the world and nobody knows it yet, because I understand that you have a genealogical connection to Arkansas, Central Arkansas, as a matter of fact, here in Little Rock, Arkansas, and I know who he is, and I'm thankful for him letting me know that genealogically you all connected. So thank you again for strengthening my theory that we run the world. All families are families by either love or blood. So either way, we're covered. Research your family and do a good job of it. And that's what I like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhonda. Jerry asks if we can get a list and contact information for all the local genealogical organizations. I think we could do that. I think we could come up with that. I will look them up as Mr. Christmas is talking during the second session and put them in the chat. So this session is applying genetic genealogy techniques. If you are just joining us, this is the second session of 2 sessions today. The first one was just an introduction of beginners, just an introduction. It was a lot of information about genetic genealogy. But we're joined by Shannon Christmas, who is a genetic genealogical expert. I'm still going to use that expert word because he knows more than I do. Rhonda knows more than I do. So, Mr. Christmas, come back, share your screen, and we'll get started on the second session. And I know nobody asked this question earlier, but I know everybody's dying to know how the last name Christmas. I mean, when I told somebody at first, they looked at me like, "Are you serious?" Yes, I'm serious. The man's last name is Christmas. So please tell us where your last name comes from.
That is an excellent question, and part of it is actually addressed in the presentation, but I will just simply say for now that it comes from England and has been around since at least 1190.
That's impressive. So yeah, 1190. Wow. Well, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you and let you get started on applying these techniques. And everybody, put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them at the end of the program, just like the last time. So enjoy.
Thank you ever so much. So this session is really about applying the various genetic genealogy techniques that I mentioned in the introductory presentation to African American genealogy mysteries, but they can be applied to generally any type of genealogy mystery. We will review some of the same concepts and same topics that were discussed in the previous presentation, and there will even be some of the same slides. So don't be put off by that. I know that it helps for some to see things more than once. So in African American genealogy, once again, it's driven by a number of various questions. One wanting to identify where one's ancestors came from in the world before ending up where we are now. I get a number of African American researchers who contact me specifically seeking to identify ancestors or ancestries on the continent of Africa. But I also receive inquiries from others who are researching African American genealogy who want to identify, or in some cases verify, their European American and slave owning ancestors, and also to identify enslaved African ancestors. As you probably have already guessed, traditional documentary genealogy provides some opportunities to research these questions, but not as many as we would like. For instance, when we're dealing with individuals who were enslaved, we often find that plantation records are either very difficult to obtain or in some cases are not preserved at all. Then we have individuals who have been told that's the best thing for them to do is to visit the US Federal Census slave schedules of 1850 and 1860. This is not a great way to go for the obvious reason that when the slaves were enumerated on this particular form, unless they were 90 years old or older, they were enumerated without a name on this particular schedule. So when you see Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates on PBS, and you see him display a slave schedule and tell a guest, oh, we think that this particular tick mark represents your ancestor, know that this is not something that I would ever recommend. And then we run into issues where, once again, state and local records, particularly in the South, may have been destroyed in the Civil War. So we get these gaping holes in the family narrative that we try to bridge over with oral history. And as we mentioned earlier today, that tends not to work as well as we had hoped, because that intergenerational game of telephone doesn't always go the way it's supposed to. People miscommunicate what happened all the time. And some ancestors who know everything, or so we think, sometimes pass away before transmitting that information to future generations. So we turn to DNA testing to help bridge those gaps. If you remember from earlier today, we have Y chromosome DNA as one of those tools because it's transmitted from father to son each generation and allows you to trace one's father's line. Mitochondrial DNA follows a similar inheritance pattern in that it is transmitted from mother to child each generation and allows you to trace one's mother's line. Note that while all humans have mitochondrial DNA, only women pass it on to their children. Men do not. Autosomal DNA and X chromosome DNA are different in that they reflect many more family lines, not just a single one. Autosomal DNA refers to DNA that is inherited through the autosomes, chromosomes 1 through 22. A chromosome is simply a package by which genetic material is transmitted from one generation to the next. So for these autosomes, you get 50% from your father and 50% from your mother. One half of that pair goes to you from your father, and one half of that pair goes to you from your mother. The X chromosome is a slightly different animal in that while everyone has at least one copy of the X chromosome, men only have the one, and they inherit that from their mothers. Women have two, and they inherit that from both their mother and their fathers. And generally, this type of DNA allows you to look at all of one's ancestors within the last 5 generations. So you can trace all of your family lines with these types of DNA. Now, remember, mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA only represent 1 to 2% of your overall genetic ancestry. But it still can be quite helpful for answering certain genealogical questions, especially for people of African descent. So here's a case study where Y-DNA was very helpful for clarifying an ancestor's paternity. So in this case, the hypothesis was that the slaveholder, Louis Yancey Christmas, was the biological father of my 2 times great-grandfather, who was his slave, Erasmus Christmas. The evidence that we had involved oral history, also the siblings' death and marriage records, in some cases listed Louis Yancey Christmas as their biological father. And the most compelling piece of evidence was that Louis Yancey Christmas wrote a will in 1857, which left Erasmus and his siblings an inheritance of over $10,000. That is $10,000 in the 1850s. That is equivalent to over $300,000 today. And the will also set Erasmus and his siblings free, or at least it was intended to. However, there is no document that specifically states that Erasmus Christmas or his siblings are the children of Louis Yancey Christmas in Louis Yancey Christmas's hand. So what do we do? Well, we turn to DNA. So I took my first DNA test back in 2009, 2010 with 23andMe. And while 23andMe focuses on autosomal DNA, they do provide what we call a Y-DNA haplogroup. And as I mentioned before, the haplogroup is essentially a genetic population that's associated with a specific genetic signature. And that genetic signature that is linked to that population is also linked to a specific part of the world. In this case, my Y-DNA haplogroup was L21. It's better known as R1b, 1b, 2a, 1a, 2f star. And that haplogroup is associated with Western Europe, especially prevalent in England and Ireland. So this gave me a clue that Erasmus Christmas, from whom I inherited this Y-DNA, definitely had, as was suspected, a European background on his paternal line. So I did more extensive DNA testing or Y chromosome DNA testing at Family Tree DNA, and that provided even more evidence supporting this hypothesis. So the hypothesis was supported by the fact that I only had one Y-DNA match at Family Tree DNA, one genetically, or I should say genealogically relevant Y-DNA match, another Mr. Christmas, and he descended from Louis Yancey Christmas's 2 times great-grandfather. And that individual, known as Thomas Cross Christmas, was our most recent common ancestor. And this Mr. Christmas went ahead and did another type of Y-DNA test that is from a company based in England. And he got one match, another Mr. Christmas based in England, which also supported the theory that the Christmases had come over to Virginia in the 1600s from England, specifically from Surrey County, England. So this answered a number of questions, not only the question associated with the original hypothesis, but also the question of where in the world did this particular line come from? Now, here is a case study where mitochondrial DNA was helpful for understanding the origins of a free people of color line. As you likely already know, there were many people of African descent who were free prior to the end of the Civil War, and they are known as free people of color. In the case of Virginia Governor Douglas Wilder, we knew from research that he descended from a long line of free people of color ancestors on his mother's side. And the question was, how did they get to be free prior to the end of the Civil War? Documentary research was not answering that question for us. Going as far back as we could possibly go, we looked at all of the various registries that free people of color had to register with prior to the end of the Civil War. And it was not supplying any sort of clue as to how they got their freedom or why. So we looked at this question from a different angle. How did these ancestors become free? But perhaps DNA could answer the question. So we had Governor Wilder take a number of DNA tests, including a mitochondrial DNA full sequence test, and we learned that his haplogroup was H7A1B. And that is a haplogroup that is very much of European origin. And all of his mitochondrial DNA matches were of Finnish origin, meaning that they had backgrounds in Finland over in Europe. And so this means that if you took a look at Governor Wilder's mother's line, at some point you would find a woman of European ancestry who had at least one child with a man of African ancestry. And as we know from history, American history, individuals in America inherited their status as either being free or enslaved from their mothers. And so if there was a European American woman who was free, who had a child with an African man, then those children that she gave birth to were free. And so this helped to answer the question of how this free people of color line got to be free in the first place. So this line goes back to Governor Wilder's ancestor, Lucy, who must have inherited her freedom from a European ancestor on her mother's side, who once again had a child with a man of African descent. Now, autosomal DNA, as I mentioned earlier, gives us many more opportunities to discover much more about many more lines in our families. As you can see from this diagram, autosomal DNA is passed down from each ancestor within the last 5 generations. But one must also keep in mind that if you go far back enough, there are some ancestors who will fall off of your genetic tree for the purposes of autosomal DNA testing. There are some ancestors who are just too far back to have passed down DNA to you at this point in time. Once again, I know that there's a big focus on getting those percentages, but just generally that is not going to answer as many questions as you might think. There are exceptions, however. For instance, there was a client that I worked with who was seeking to identify her biological father. And she really struggled with that because she had been told so many different stories about so many different candidates. And she simply kept files and researched each one of them. But the paper trail was not sufficient for answering her questions. So she did a DNA test and discovered that she was 25% East Asian, which was something that she was not expecting. But as we went back over the list of candidates, I learned that one of those candidates was half Filipino. His father was a Filipino. And so it made sense that this was the most likely candidate, because that would explain the 25% East Asian number that showed up on Ancestry DNA. So we reached out to this gentleman. He took a DNA test, and he was confirmed to be this client's biological father. So again, the real power of this type of DNA testing comes from identity by descent detection. If you recall from earlier, identity by descent refers to stretches of shared DNA on chromosomes 1 through 22 and the X chromosome. That shared DNA indicates that you and the person you share that DNA with share a common ancestor. Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA's Family Finder, MyHeritage DNA, and Living DNA will provide you with a list of relatives based on this particular capability. Now, we measure DNA and centimorgans. Just as I would measure the size of a room in square feet, we measure DNA and centimorgans. It's just a unit of measurement. And this DNA is inherited in segments, pieces of DNA. The longer the DNA segments, the more segments you share, the closer the relationship likely is. The shorter the DNA segments, the fewer the DNA segments are, the more distant the relationship is likely to be. Now, using this information, using these data points, we can go back and answer those questions about where in the world our ancestors came from. We can identify European American and or slave holding ancestors, and also identify enslaved African ancestors. We began to answer these questions by using methodologies such as clustering and genetic networking, where you find a group of DNA matches who all match each other and all match you. And then you collect their family trees and compare them. The individual who appears in all of those trees, the couple that appears as an ancestor in all of those trees, is the source of the shared DNA. They are the connection. They are your most recent common ancestors. So the first step in this, once again, is identifying and visualizing these groups of DNA matches who match you and also match each other. The matches in these genetic networks are bound to share a common ancestral line. Again, you compare the family trees of the matches in a cluster. And once you do that, you'll be able to identify the most recent common ancestor. Each one of those DNA test companies, Ancestry, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA's Family Finder, and MyHeritage, provide you with an opportunity to manually do this type of genetic networking just by looking at shared matches, or what they call relatives in common at 23andMe, or the in common with feature at Family Tree DNA's Family Finder. I find that the shared matches tool at MyHeritage DNA and the relatives in common feature at 23andMe tend to be especially powerful because they allow you to not only look at how these matches match each other just as matches to each other, but also to see the amount of DNA they share with each other. So you can see at 23andMe and at MyHeritage DNA the actual predicted relationship between two matches. You can see where someone who is listed as a shared match is actually the son or daughter or the parent of a particular match using these tools. That's not something that you can do at Ancestry DNA. And as of right now, that is not something that you can do at Family Tree DNA's Family Finder. To make the best of these tools, there's actually something very simple that you can do. Annotate your match list. Each of these different sites has a notes feature, meaning that you can open up a matches profile and enter information in the notes box about the match. Specifically, once you have found a pair of common ancestors, or perhaps even a group of common ancestors with a given match, you want to take that information and put it into the notes. And do the same with the shared matches. At Ancestry, they take this a step further and supply you with colored dots to group your matches. You want to group your matches by the most recent common ancestors. So as you see in this screenshot here, the first individual in the list is a second to third cousin who I was able to determine is related to me via a set of most recent common ancestors on my mother's paternal side. Solomon Neverdon and Zechariah Blackwell of Fauquier County, Virginia. So I took that information and I placed it into the notes box. You can see that note highlighted in a red box. And you can see just above that box, both a star, a golden star, and what appears to be a navy blue dot. That navy blue dot is associated now with Solomon Neverdon and Zachariah Blackwell. So any matches that I find who are direct descendants of Solomon Neverdon and Zachariah Blackwell get this blue dot. And I can actually, if you look at this screenshot more holistically, click on groups and click on the blue dot within the groups dropdown and only look at matches that are descendants of this couple. The golden star I use to indicate that I have sent a message to this person to transfer their raw DNA data to getmatch.com, a third-party website where I can actually see the segments of DNA painted on the chromosomes. And I did something similar with the second match, where I found the common ancestors that we shared and listed those common ancestors in the notes feature. And because this individual did not have a tree, but they had just enough information for me to figure out how they were related and build a tree for them, I write an explanatory, or I should say explanatory paragraph explaining exactly how they descend from the most recent common ancestors. So that is one way to make the best use of this. And then once you've done this, you can look at the shared matches and at the very least hypothesize that they might have something to do with the most recent common ancestors you've identified already. So for HB, I can look at the shared matches and say, okay, there's a good chance that these shared matches have something to do with Peter Allen Sr. and Alice Bryant, my great-great-grandparents on my paternal side. So many of your matches on the various DNA websites will not have family trees. But do not let that stop you from, well, stalking your matches and building trees for them to figure out exactly how they are related to you. Specifically, you want to use sites such as People Search and Been Verified to learn more about your match's family, and where your match and his family members or her family members have been living. You also want to seek out obituaries and find grave entries that may include long sections of paragraphs of information about how your match is related to other individuals in the world, and give you enough information to begin building out family trees on Ancestry and or Family Search. You also want to think of some other ways to collect information useful for building family trees. Sometimes, while matches may not have family trees posted for us to use, they will post photographs of themselves. Many of the individuals who have done DNA testing are very self-involved, and they like looking at themselves, and they like having random strangers look at them too. And so they will post their photos thinking that they have provided you with a great gift. Some matches might only respond to your messaging to supply you with hundreds of photographs of themselves. When that happens, I always say to myself, my name is not Wilhelmina. I am not a talent scout. I am not a modeling agent. And many of these people providing me with photo galleries of themselves would not fare well if I were either of those things. That said, we can use these photographs to capture more information that is useful for building family trees and determining how these matches are related. If you use Google Chrome, then you can do a right click on a match's photograph, and you will be provided with a menu that offers you the opportunity to search Google for this image. That may lead you to results if you click on it that take you to the social media profiles of your match, or something else that is out there on the World Wide Web that can get you started on building that family tree and connecting you to your relatives. You also want to Google your match's username, because your match may use that username. They may use that as an alias on other sites where there's more information that you can use to build out their family tree and compare it to yours. When you have found your match's social media presence, you want to scan it and milk it for information on other relatives and build out that tree. Now, there is a site called geneticaffairs.com, which will automate the process of clustering and genetic networking through their AutoClusters tool. Genetic Affairs will simply retrieve the match data, including the shared matches, and build out a diagram similar to what you see in this image that charts the clusters of matches who match you and match each other. So visit geneticaffairs.com, start an account, and know that this works very well with gedmatch.com, DNA.com, and MyHeritageDNA, because these sites have already integrated the AutoCluster tool onto their websites. So you already can access AutoClusters on GEDmatch if you are a tier 1 subscriber, meaning that you are donating $10 per month. And you can use this at DNA.com, another third-party website, and MyHeritageDNA. And you will see when you start using that AutoCluster tool why this is helpful, why the annotating is especially helpful. So I used the AutoCluster feature, and this is a screenshot from my results. As you can see, the column all the way to the right has what they call a notes preview, where it will show the notes that I have created for each of these matches over on the website that the matches were pulled from. And so you see all of these matches are in the same cluster, cluster 1. And you see a pattern in the notes for this cluster. Common ancestors, Richard Lewis Jr. and Mary Terrell. Another set of 2 times great-grandparents on my paternal side. So this cluster is associated with those common ancestors. And I already know that because I looked at the trees of almost everyone in this cluster and put those notes in, showing how we were related. However, there are 3 people, M, Michael, and Ashley, for whom I could not find a common ancestor when attempting to build out trees for them. However, because they are in cluster 1, I know that they must have something to do with Richard Lewis Jr. and or Mary Terrell. So annotate, annotate, annotate. It is the easiest thing you can do and will make every other step you take that much easier. So again, enter notes for all of your matches in the commercial DNA databases. If you've learned nothing else, learn that. You want to list the names of the most recent common ancestors in the notes section. And if necessary, you also want to explain the pathway from the match back to the most recent common ancestors. That way, it will be nice and easy for you to assign each cluster to a specific ancestral line. Unsolved matches, the matches for whom you have no information, who are placed in a cluster that you've already assigned, likely have some connection to the ancestors you've assigned that cluster to. Okay. Now, another methodology we spoke of earlier today is chromosome mapping. This involves, once again, tagging specific DNA segments to specific ancestors. It's a 2-step process. The first step is segment triangulation. Through this process, you find matches who all match each other on the same DNA segment. And you know that because they all match each other and they all match you on that same segment, they must have inherited that shared segment from a common ancestor, just as you see in the diagram here. This is what we call a triangulated group. The next step is pedigree comparison. You collect the family trees of everyone in that triangulated group. And once you've compared the trees, you look for what they have in common, specifically which ancestors they have in common. Those ancestors are likely the ancestors from whom you inherited that shared DNA segment. So here's a case study where I found a triangulated group on chromosome 3 and used it to break down a brick wall and find a brand new family line. So one of my closest DNA matches initially was an elderly writer based in Portland, Oregon. When he saw my first name, he said, "You must be one of my Irish cousins." Not so much. However, upon initial conversation, we learned that we had grandparents that came from the same place in North Carolina, Warren County, North Carolina. But that was the extent of what we found in common. So I built the hypothesis that we are likely related on my paternal side, because my entire paternal side, for the most part, comes from Warren County, North Carolina. So I tested my father, and he too was a match to this gentleman. And I also tested my paternal grandfather and showed that the DNA segment was inherited from my paternal grandfather by my father and passed down to me. But I also looked at the other matches who were matching up on this segment. And I looked at their family trees and I compared them all. What I found was that everyone who had a family tree descended from Gideon Hunt Macon and Priscilla Jones of Warren County, North Carolina. And this was a very strong clue that the segment was inherited from that couple who were around in the 18th century, and that I, via my father, via his father, must descend from this couple somehow. They must be related, and it's very likely that we were descendants. But there was no oral history of descent from this particular couple, and there was no documentation of descent from this couple. What I found was that using even more cousins, more relatives, I should say, who descended from various family lines, I could determine that this segment was passed down from my grandfather's mother, from her father, and learned that Gideon Hunt Macon and Priscilla Jones had a daughter, and that daughter, actually, Sarah Macon, married a Philemon Hawkins, or I should say John Hawkins. I'm getting ahead of myself. And John and Sarah Macon had a son named Philemon Hawkins, who married a Merry Christmas. And they had a son named Adam Hawkins, who was, in fact, my 4 times great-grandfather and the father of my enslaved ancestor, my 3 times great-grandmother, Lucinda Davis. But without this, I would never have known. So here's another case study where DNA saved the day. So I got a match by the name of William on 23andMe. He was a 4th cousin match, or I should say a predicted 4th cousin. And I noticed that we both had the same mitochondrial DNA haplogroup. And I took that as an indication that we just might have the same mitochondrial DNA ancestor, and that perhaps if I looked at his mother's line, I would find a common ancestor on my family tree. I was especially encouraged by that, by the fact that this gentleman lives in the same place that my mother's mother was living some time ago, Barnwell County, South Carolina. So I followed my instincts and I had my mother test. And as you can see from the diagram on the bottom of the screenshot there, my mother shared even more DNA with William. But I wanted to, once again, get the most precise evidence I could get. And so I also had my mother's maternal uncle test, also a relative on that direct maternal line. And he too shared DNA with William and shared even more DNA than my mother did. What was especially important in this particular case was that William and my granduncle actually matched up on the X chromosome. Now, what do we know about the X chromosome? Men only inherit X DNA from their mothers, meaning that William and my granduncle must share an ancestor on their mother's side, who is the source of that X DNA. So I've got a pathway now to look for when I look at William's family tree. But I also needed to do some work on my own tree. At the time, this was my family tree. This was my brick wall. My great-great-grandmother, who was known as Alice Revines. I could not identify her parents. I could not find her in any documentation. My granduncle, who was also the one who did the DNA test for me, told me that her parents were Samuel Revines and Charity Revines. So I got to work and started looking for them using Ancestry and Family Search and every other resource I could get my hands on. I never did find a Samuel Revines and Charity Revines. So I took a different approach. I started doing wild card searches and just eliminated the surname Revines from the equation. And I found 4 couples in South Carolina where the husband was named Samuel and the wife was named Charity. And one of those couples was in the right place at the right time and also had a daughter named Alice, who was just the right age to be my great-great-grandmother. And so this was it. This was the other side of the brick wall. I had found Alice's parents. However, their surname was not Revines. Their surname was Wine, as documented in records from the census and death certificates and more. I don't know where Revines came from. I think my great-grandmother may have made that up. But at any rate, as I was going through the documentation and building trees, not only for myself, but also for William, I came across something very illuminating. I got a death certificate for Charity, and I found the names of her biological parents, Alex Brown and Sylvia. And I looked at other death certificates and found that Sylvia's maiden name was Willis. And I also took a look at this from a different angle at the census level, looking at William's ancestors. And I found that he had an ancestor named Lavinia Brown. And if you look at the 1870 US Census, you see that Lavinia is in the household of Alex Brown and Sylvia. Essentially, Lavinia and Charity were sisters. Alex Brown and Sylvia Willis were the common ancestors linking William and my more immediate family. So again, the common enslaved ancestors were Alex Brown and Sylvia Willis. Oral history and documentary research helped to corroborate the DNA evidence. I got 3 new surnames through this exercise, and the DNA segments that I share with William are now references for new DNA matches who also share these segments. In other words, any new individuals who show up as matches, who match up on these segments, must have some connection to Alex Brown and Sylvia Willis. And yes, Sylvia Willis is the most distant known source of that mitochondrial DNA. And the DNA segments that were identified as being the genetic inheritance from Alex Brown and Sylvia Willis have already helped some adoptees who showed up as DNA matches to me and other members of my family. It helps them to find their biological relatives, their biological parents. And so my family tree was expanded through this process. This is what this line looks like now. And in addition to that, getting that maiden surname for Sylvia was helpful in identifying her final slaveholder, or one of her final slaveholders. Her slaveholder was Williamson Watson Willis. And this screenshot you see here comes from his estate papers, where Sylvia and 3 of her children were listed on the slave inventory as a family group. You have Sylvia, you have Lavinia listed as Viney, you have Charity, and you have their brother, who's named after their father, Alex. Now, some people, through the process of DNA testing, also find that they have unexpected African ancestry. According to a recent study done by 23andMe, at least 1.4% of those who consider themselves European Americans here in the US carry at least 2% African ancestry. 3.5% of European Americans have at least 1% or more African ancestry. And about 5% of people who self-identify as European Americans in South Carolina and Louisiana are found to have at least 2% African ancestry. European Americans with African ancestry comprise as much as 12% of European Americans in Louisiana and South Carolina, and about 1 in 10 individuals in other parts of the South. And people may think, where did this come from? I know that when I first got into genetic genealogy, that was a question that was asked of me many, many times from people who were unaware of any African descended forebears. How did this happen? And I always used to respond with, when a man and a woman love each other very much. We have to understand that people of African descent and people of European descent have been, well, copulating uh, one way or another and producing children for quite some time. And their living descendants are now finding out that this happened. So this is where this comes from. And there are ways to dig into and research this unexpected African ancestry, largely by applying some of the techniques that I mentioned before, looking at those matches that specifically carry African ancestry in them, seeing how they cluster, how they are related to each other, comparing their family trees to each other, and identifying a pair of common ancestors that may also be your common ancestors. Another way to go about this is to download your ancestry composition segment data from 23andMe. That will provide you with a spreadsheet where you can actually identify which segments of DNA are African versus European versus Asian versus Native American. And you can look at where those segments are on the chromosomes and then download your matching segment data from 23andMe and see which DNA matches also share those African DNA segments. And those will be your first clues for researching your African ancestry. Collect family trees from the closest of those matches, sharing those segments. Compare those, identify commonalities, and search and research their family trees. And just repeat these steps over and over again. You may also want to make good use of a site called DNApainter.com to help with this. It works best if you've already tested one parent at 23andMe and one child, because that means the data of the child has been phased. The ancestry composition data has been phased, meaning that they've already separated the DNA that you've inherited from your father from the DNA that you've inherited from your mother. If you've not tested a parent-child duo or a parent-child trio at 23andMe, then the DNA Painter route won't be as useful because the data is not phased, meaning that a specific copy of, say, chromosome 17 has not been associated with the father versus the mother. The DNA just is on chromosome 17, and they haven't decided which copy is the paternal copy or which copy is the maternal copy. So more about DNA Painter and its utilities. It allows you to do chromosome mapping in a really fun, really easy way. So if you want to get into chromosome mapping, you want to start at DNA Painter if you can. Once you've identified the most recent common ancestor with a specific match, go ahead and copy the matching DNA segment data from 23andMe, Family Tree DNA's Family Finder, or MyHeritage DNA, and paste it into the Paint a Match box that you get at DNA Painter. And once you've pasted that, you click Overlay these segments, and then you will have the option to save the match. When you get that option, click on it, and you will be provided with a number of different options to, number one, say how you're connected to the match if you already know. You will also have the option to place the name of the match on that segment. and associates that DNA segment with a specific ancestor. That's what chromosome mapping is all about, assigning the matching segments to the most recent common ancestor. And at DNA Painter, you can select a color for that particular segment on your chromosome map. So in this case, in the case of Michael Jr., I know that we are both descendants of my 3 times great-grandparents, Louis Yancey Christmas and Jenny, who we heard about earlier. And so I know they are on my paternal side. So I put that in, and I selected the navy blue color. And I also put some notes in about Michael Jr. and how we're related, specifically the pathway that he descends from Louis Yancey Christmas and Jenny. And I saved the segments. And so I know that anyone else who matches up on these segments must have something to do with Louis Yancey Christmas and or Jenny. And there is the segments that I share with Michael, painted on the chromosomes with all of the others that I have entered into DNA painting or DNA Painter for the chromosome mapping process. And you can see the legend on the right where I've associated specific colors with specific ancestors. So once again, you want to start assigning ancestors to your closest DNA matches and work your way down your match list. Don't do this for parents. Don't do this for siblings because it is just going to take over your entire chromosome map and not really get you anywhere. You already know who your parents are in most cases. You want to use cousins with this. You want to use half aunts or half uncles with this. You want to use grand aunts and grand uncles, third cousins, second cousins, fourth cousins. Those are the ones you want to use for this because you can then assign the DNA segments to the common ancestors you share with those matches. And like I said, start with the closest and work your way down your match list. If you've only tested at Ancestry DNA, then you do not have access to matching DNA segment data. So you need to transfer your raw DNA data to sites where you have access to matching DNA segment data. That means GEDmatch. That means Family Tree DNA's Family Finder. That means MyHeritage. That means also testing with 23andMe if you have not already done so. And once again, 23andMe users who have tested one or more parents can actually download the ancestry composition raw DNA data and actually import that data into DNA Painter to see the biogeographical origin of each DNA segment. So you can actually associate a DNA segment with a specific part of the world and then use the process that we just discussed, using the shared matching data, the DNA segments that you share with your matches, and overlay that. And when you do that, you can see, okay, this segment not only comes from, say, my 3 times great-grandfather, but it also is, say, British and Irish in terms of origin. That's something that you can do. But again, it only works if you have a parent-child duo tested at 23andMe or a parent-child trio done at 23andMe. DNA Painter also has another tool that can be very useful to you called the Shared Centimorgan tool that allows you to essentially predict relationships build hypotheses, and test hypotheses. So essentially, you take the number of centimorgans that you share with someone, the shared DNA. You enter into the shared centimorgan project that number, and once you've entered it, this will not only convert the centimorgans into percentages, it will also provide you with a list of relationships associated with that amount of shared DNA. And so you can begin to build an hypothesis about how you are related to someone. There's also the what are the odds feature. Now, the what are the odds feature essentially allows you to take a group of matches and build an hypothesis about how they are related to you and you are related to them. To do this, you simply enter your matches. You enter a specific genetic network into a tree in the what are the odds feature. Once you do that, you then want to select yourself as an hypothesis, and you will get a list of probabilities for each possible relationship or impossible relationship. And you'll be able to eliminate certain possibilities from the list of hypotheses and focus in on specific lines that you might want to research. This works especially well for unknown parentage cases, and also in some cases where you're trying to find out who the enslaved person's slaveholder ancestor was. Many African Americans who have enslaved ancestors find genetic networks of European American relatives. And when you find yourself in that situation, you want to take that genetic network and enter it into the what are the odds tool as soon as you can. And once again, you just enter the matches and the amount of shared DNA for each match into a tree like this, connecting them all back to this common ancestor connecting them. And then you put yourself into a variety of hypothetical relationships, and you will get a list of probabilities showing you which probabilities or which possibilities rather are more likely. So once again, this goes on the list of things you must remember. So here's a case study where this worked especially well. So there was a long-standing oral history that Mr. Frank Plummer, featured in this portrait, was the son of a Dr. Alfred Plummer of Warren County, North Carolina, and also the son of the formerly enslaved Rebecca Hall. In fact, Frank Plummer was said to be the first child of Rebecca Hall, and the father was said to be Dr. Alfred Plummer, which I found to be a very interesting story, simply because some of the details around it were, well, questionable. They specifically made it seem as if there was a sort of extended slavery for Rebecca Hall. And I just found that to be rather curious, to say the least. And the only evidence was the oral history, saying that an Alfred Plummer was Frank's father. But a number of things, once again, just made me question it all. And so there were a number of descendants of Frank Plummer who had done DNA testing. And I thought, why not examine their results and see what we can see? And so, in researching this, we found that there were two Alfred Plumbers who were around that time and were at an age of reproductive maturity and could have potentially sired Frank Plummer. So we looked at that. And we got a bunch of DNA matches who descended from this Plummer family, and we entered them. We entered this genetic network into the what are the odds tool to evaluate this particular hypothesis. And we found something very interesting. We found that many of the closest DNA matches were coming from descendants of Dr. Alfred Plummer's brother, Henry Lynn Plummer. Henry Lynn Plummer was the father of the other Alfred Plummer in the family, who could have sired Frank Plummer. And from this analysis, we learned something, that it was entirely impossible for Dr. Alfred Plummer to be the father of Frank Plummer, based on the numbers, based on the science. And the most likely hypothesis was that the true biological father was Private Alfred A. Plummer, the nephew of Dr. Alfred Plummer, which no one would have thought to even research or knew how to research if it were not for genetic testing. And you can see it here. The results show that it was a statistical impossibility for Dr. Alfred Plummer to have been the father of Frank Plummer, and that it had to have been Private Alfred Plummer. Now, many individuals have contacted me seeking to connect with their African origins. And the best way to do that is not through looking at admixture results, but through looking at DNA relatives who come from Africa. These matches from Africa are far more genealogically relevant and are far more indicative of one's ancestry. They provide far more insight into where your African ancestors may have come from and who your African family really is. Admixture results just reflect general similarity. Your DNA matches reflect actual ancestral lines. They are your true links to the past. So you want to focus on that. These segments can be used using segment triangulation to learn more about specific family lines if you use it correctly. So once again, this process can take quite a while to gel. A lot of these matches need a lot of help, a lot of encouragement, and some of them may not even want to be bothered with you. So once again, be a triple threat, know the DNA, know the genealogy, and know how to be a cyber stalker. Learn the technology and relearn the technology and persist until you prevail. So once again, thank you ever so much. I stand ready for questions. And if you want to reach out later, feel free to email me or to visit my website. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Wow, it's a lot of science. So tell me how you got into genetic genealogy. Do you have a science background? I mean, you obviously know a lot about the science. So how did you get into this?
That is a wonderful question. I remember back in fourth grade in the early 90s that there was a lot of conversation going on about the advancement of human genetics and where we would be later in the future. And much of that conversation was focused on the biomedical applications. I was far more interested in what it could teach us about families, about human history, about our connections in the world. And I reflect on that because obviously as I became an adult, and began doing genealogical research, I came across situations where I had questions that my elders, the living relatives, could not answer. And I looked to DNA to be able to answer those questions. And it has been quite effective over the last decade or so.
Great. I want to tell everybody that I did put the links to those genealogical organizations that Rhonda mentioned. I think I got all of them. Rhonda, I put Arkansas Genealogical Society, the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, Arkansas Chapter, and Heritage Seekers in the chat. So you have direct links to those websites. You might also look on Facebook and other social media providers or services platforms to find groups there as well. I think that Facebook has quite a few last name or surname groups that you can join to help your genealogy journey go forward. So Ann Buchanan has a question. She says, my uncle is 102 years old. Wow, congratulations on to your uncle. And she says, I can get his DNA. I need to understand what to do with his results.
That is a great question. Once you get his results, the first thing you want to do is look at his DNA match list and work with the closest match. See how they might be related. If you are able to identify exactly how they are related, then once again, annotate that particular match's profile, and then look at the matches that he shares with that particular match, and look through their trees to see how they might be related. And just keep going through that process over and over and over again, and grouping your matches so that you can use that information to build hypotheses about those matches that are far more difficult to resolve.
And that DNA painter thing, I mean, I'm such a visual learner. So being able to see, when you put it in, so a lot of people in the chat are saying, when you were showing DNA painter, that's the part I was reading, they were like, wow, amazing. And it's incredible. And I'm on it. I mean, I'd be honest, I'd never heard of DNA painter until today. Now I don't know a lot about genetic genealogy, so that may be why, but that is a really cool service. Is that a paid service or?
Great question. So it is free to join DNA Painter.
Okay.
There are some more advanced features that are available to those who it's a very low cost subscription, and it will allow you to build multiple chromosome maps, not just one. So if you want to build one for yourself and then one for each of your parents or your children, etc., then you would want to get a subscription. Otherwise, you can just open up a different account for each chromosome map you want to do for free.
So Latifa Joyner Williams says, since my mom and I are both on 23andMe, will I be able to figure out who my father's side is?
Yes, because you will be able to separate the matches that are on your mother's side from the matches that are on your father's side. And 23andMe automatically does that for you if you have tested both yourself and at least one of your biological parents.
Okay. Pam Warner says, how can we get a link to the recording? Oh, this is really for me. How can we get a link to the recording? You will get an email from me Monday afternoon with the direct link to the recording. So you'll be able to get it that way. I hope to do that on Monday. Fingers crossed. I have a busy Monday, but that's on my list of things to do. Lots of thank yous for making the information so concise.
Oh, you are more than welcome.
And we've got a virtual family reunion coming up. So this will be great information to share with your virtual, with people's virtual family reunion.
Yes, absolutely. And just remember, it is a numbers game. You want to get as many of your family members tested as possible, especially the oldest living generation, because they have more DNA from the ancestors than the younger generations.
Yes, yes. And Stella says the to the letter DNA that you mentioned in the first session, where they can get DNA off of, you know, stamps that were licked or envelopes. We don't lick stamps anymore, right? They're stickers now. So,
Yes.
but previously, that's ingenious to try to get DNA from those. And it seems like they
Yes.
used something like that in some criminal cases. Was that how they got the Golden State Killer? I can't remember.
No, that wasn't how they got the Golden State Killer.
Okay. Okay.
That
Okay.
was through a process that is very similar to, well, it's identical to how we find the biological parents of adoptees. They simply took the DNA that was found from the crime scenes of the Golden State Killer, reanalyzed it so that it was in a format that could be uploaded to gedmatch.com, looked at the DNA matches to that sample, looked at the family trees of the profiles that were matching that DNA, and were able to essentially deduce that the Golden State Killer suspect must be a descendant of this family. And so they went through that family until they got the person who they believe is the Golden State Killer.
That was I just remember hearing about that and how incredible it was to use DNA that way. Latifa also asks a follow-up question. What do I do with my DNA to use DNA paint? I guess how do you get it in to you import it, I assume.
Well, that depends on what it is you are looking to do with DNA Painter. If you are simply looking to paint your chromosomes from an ancestral perspective, you're looking to do the chromosome map, then what you do is what I explained earlier. You compare your match to you, say on 23andMe, using their chromosome browser, and you will see the exact locations of the shared DNA. You copy those from the website and you paste them into DNA Painter's chromosome map. And you select the appropriate selections accordingly. You put in their name, you select a color to represent a pair of most recent common ancestors, you put in their names, and voila, that segment is now painted on your chromosome map. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle, and you get more pieces as you go along, and you just assemble them on the site. That's what you do if you are looking to do chromosome mapping there. If you are looking to do the biogeographical admixture mapping that I showed, then that is where you would download the ancestry composition raw data file from 23andMe. Once again, you have to go to ancestry composition, select scientific details. You will see an option to download raw data. Once you've done that, you can then import it to DNA Painter. But that only works if you've tested a parent-child duo or parent-child trio.
So Penny asks, lately she's been hearing, oops, the chat moved. Okay, here we go. Lately, I've been hearing about services to do ancient ancestry analysis. Do you know any? She wants to know if you know anything about that.
I have heard of that. I do not recommend participating. I find that for genealogy, it will not be informative. It really is for entertainment purposes only.
And then almost at the same second, two people asked a question, the same question about DNA privacy. Are you concerned about DNA privacy? What will happen to one's DNA in the future beyond this type of research?
That is a good question. To be clear, this type of testing has been taking place for well over a decade. I'll say that for autosomal DNA, and even longer than that for Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. I think someone puts the official date of genetic genealogy at 20 years. I will go further than that and say it goes all the way back to at least 1998. And since then, a lot has happened, but very little of it has been negative. I find that the term privacy is thrown away, or rather thrown around, too loosely. What is private? Why should it be private? What is privacy? Those are questions that I don't think many people ask when they use the term. And when I ask individuals what they mean by privacy, I get something straight from a work of science fiction, where they talk about concerns where they might be cloned. And I always think to myself, now, why would someone want to clone you? But just generally, we have gotten into an era where people are demanding that we close off everything such that no one is able to access evidence of another person's existence. And I think that is simply beyond the pale and simply beyond the scope of reality. There's always been documentation of people's existence. And I don't think that that should change. In terms of genetic privacy, when I think of that, I think about the potential for misuse in terms of the biomedical context. But the deeper and deeper that I've gotten into genetic genealogy, the less and less I see that potential. Many people used to speak of this mythical insurance blacklist that would be generated from DNA test results. Quite frankly, the insurance companies are not so interested in even attempting to do that, largely because the types of DNA testing that we are involved in don't reveal as much about health as one would think. In fact, there was a project that Ancestry was doing with Calico, a division of Google, to look at longevity and DNA. And what they found was that DNA was not as connected as they thought. And so they shut down the project and shut down the partnership.
Wow.
So there's a lot that we don't know about DNA, but there's also a lot that we have learned about DNA. And I think that when we use the term genetic privacy, we need to think about what that really is, what that really means, and what that really entails.
Well, thank you so much for doing this remotely. This has been great. This has been so interesting. I want to remind everybody that next Saturday is a bonus Saturday at the Roberts Library. So come and visit us between 12 and 4. The more people who come, I'll tell you a little secret. We're kind of doing these to test to see how many people come on Saturdays. So the more people we come, we might be able to justify being open more frequently on Saturdays. So if you want us to be open on Saturday, come and visit us next Saturday to show that the need exists. So Rhonda's here again, and also Finding Family Facts is August 9th, I think. It's the second Monday. So whatever the second Monday is, at 3:30, you can join Rhonda and I for a brief overview of genealogy, plus Rhonda will try to answer questions as much as possible. So
I just want to say again, thank you for everyone that participated, and do use your public library. We're here to help assist you. And there is no dumb question, only a question that needs to be answered. So ask your questions. And again, Mr. Christmas, you are the greatest. Helping me
rock
out.
star.
Yeah.
Thank you ever so much. I truly appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, my mom is just now calling. Y'all, that's really impressive that we made it 4 hours without my mother calling. Sorry. She must know it's time. But yes, thank you, Mr. Christmas, for doing this for us. Y'all email him, go to his website, hire him to do private consulting. You have truly been a rock star, and we do appreciate it. So
Oh, thank you so
everybody
much.
have a great afternoon. I hope it's nice and not too hot wherever you are. So we'll see everybody next Saturday in person.